Welcome to the Columbus Symphony Orchestra's Know the Score, hosted by Maestro George Del Gobbo. This week's edition will focus on our upcoming concert, Serenade. The performance features works by Kalinikov, Souk, and Tchaikovsky. We hope you enjoy this week's edition of Know the Score.
Welcome to this edition of Know the Score. We're going to be talking about the music you'll hear on February 12th. It involves just the string section of the orchestra. There's an old joke that string players like to tell of what do you have if you have an orchestra without strings? And the answer is a band. Now the winds, who would be in that band, have some pretty raunchy jokes about string players that we won't go into. But the fact is that the string section in any orchestra is a section that does most of the work in the orchestra in terms of playing. It's uneven to the point where some years ago an orchestra in Germany sued for more pay because they felt they were working harder than their compatriots in the wind and percussion section, and that they ought to be paid more because of that. As justified as that suit was, they lost. And everybody in that and just about every other orchestra is paid the same. The triangle player who plays maybe one note in a concert gets the same salary as the violinist who plays 5,000 notes. So by the time you get to that level, it's too late. You should have thought about it when you were a kid. Triangle, good job. You have to be able to count. It's a lot cheaper to buy a triangle than a violin. But it is what it is. But consequently, because the strings are so dominant in most orchestral compositions, there's a lot of music that's written for just strings alone. Because the stringed instruments were developed historically much earlier than most wind instruments and were much more sophisticated. For example, when Stradivarius was making his instruments, most wind instruments were quite rudimentary and couldn't do anything like what you could do on a violin. And it took a while for the wind instruments to catch up. It really wasn't until the 19th century, and sometimes well into the 19th century, with the development of key systems and valves and all those things, that allowed wind instruments to play with more facility and to be able to handle more complex and complicated parts in any orchestra texture. But still, composers, even after that, found fascination in writing just for the strings alone and exploring the possibilities of string sound and the way strings can work together. And so that's what we're going to present to you on February 12th, three pieces that are written for strings only. The three composers, one of which you know, and two of which you maybe don't know, are all Eastern European, Slavic kind of composers. The first one is a Russian composer named Vasily Kalinikov. He lived in the second half of the 19th century. His father was a policeman in Russia, and consequently he was not able to afford going to the Moscow Conservatory. He couldn't afford the tuition there, so he went to a lesser school, apparently, the Moscow Philharmonic Society School. While there, he came to the attention of Tchaikovsky and others and was encouraged by them. Tragically, he lived a very short life. He contracted tuberculosis while he was in his 20s, and he had to flee Moscow for a warmer climate in the Crimea, where he spent most of his life, and he died 2 days before his 35th birthday. Even though he continued to work while he was ill, he did not have a large output simply because of the fact that he died so young and that he was so sick most of the time. He wrote two symphonies while he was working, the first of which has become a piece that's in the standard repertoire, especially in Russia, where it is played frequently. And he wrote a number of other pieces, and one of them is this little serenade in G minor that we're going to play. And it's a lovely little piece that's noted for its very delicate melody and for his kind of innovative use of the pizzicato strings. Pizzicato is an Italian word that means plucked. So when you see violinists using their fingers to pluck the strings like a guitar, that's pizzicato. And you can make all kinds of sounds with that, using that technique, depending on how you play it. But Kalinikov used pizzicato in this piece more than normal for the time. It's a lovely little piece. As he lived and worked, he couldn't really make a living as a composer, so he spent a lot of time working as a music copyist. And you may not know this or appreciate it, but when a composer writes a piece of music, what the composer basically produces is the score. And that's like the script to a play. It's the entire piece written on many music staves, as many as 15, 20, depending on how big the orchestra is. And it's arranged on those pages according to the groups of instruments, and everything is there. But the composer very rarely will then take that score and copy out the parts that are used by the players when they play the piece. Sometimes they won't even copy the score. So this work falls to the music copyist, which it's not so much anymore, but was a horrible job involving onion skin paper and ink, and very messy and very easy to make mistakes and very hard to correct mistakes. Very tedious work, but essential work, because otherwise the piece couldn't be performed if their parts weren't there. So you hear stories often of Beethoven, who was so late with his scores that the copyists were literally writing out the parts right before the performance, and so on. But it was a way to make a living. It wasn't a great way to make a living, but it was. Today it's a little easier because we can use computers for a lot of that work, and while I suspect it's still a little tedious, it's a lot neater than it was, and there's no pen and ink involved. And we're not talking ballpoints either, we're talking ink nibs and dipping into ink wells. So Kalinikov, kind of a footnote in Russian music of the 19th century, but one that deserves to be considered. The second composer is Josef Souk. He was a Czech composer who grew up in a musical family. He was a composer and a violinist. He played in the Souk quartet for many, many, many years. When he was a young man, he went to school and was a student of Dvorak at one point. And Dvorak recognized that Souk had a lot of talent as a composer and encouraged him. Encouraged him to the point, I suppose, where Souk married his daughter, Otile. Not only was Dvorak a mentor for Souk, he was also his father-in-law. At one point, near the end of his student days, Dvorak suggested to Souk that he write a less serious piece. Apparently, Souk had a very serious kind of dour, kind of lamenting kind of style, and his music was dark and not very happy, let's just say. And Dvorak said, you know, what you need to do is write a piece that's lighter. It will do you good to write a piece that expresses the other side of the emotional spectrum. And so Souk did, and he wrote this Serenade in E-flat major, and it became his most famous piece, and the one that is played of his music more often than not. And it is a delightful piece in which he manages to shed all of these more dour feelings and present a piece that is full of light and beauty, and is very expressive and emotionally accessible, and it's a joy to listen to. And only strings. We don't need winds for this. Finally on the program is a piece, I'm going to be in so much trouble, is a piece with another Russian composer. This one you all know, Peter Tchaikovsky, the most famous Russian composer maybe ever. I don't know if you count Stravinsky, but certainly of the 19th century Russian composers, he was the most famous, the most popular in his own time, spent many, many months and years touring, and even in America, where he played in Carnegie Hall, promoting his own music, and he was well known and well liked as he is today. 1880, when he was 40 years old, was a difficult year for him. His father passed away. He had just returned from a tour, and he was not in very good shape physically or mentally. And he was also kind of toying with becoming an alcoholic. his consumption of alcohol was on the increase to the point where it would become a problem. So it was a very difficult time for him in every way, but he managed to produce 4 pieces that we all know. One is the Second Piano Concerto, one is the tone poem Capriccio Italien, and one is the 1812 Overture that we all know because we hear it played on the 4th of July in a lot of American cities. I'm not sure why, because it has nothing to do with American history, but it gives orchestras a chance to fire off some cannons, and everybody loves that. Can't have enough cannons. And the 4th piece he wrote during this time was the Serenade in C major. Tchaikovsky was enamored of the music of Mozart. He thought that Mozart's aesthetic and Mozart's expressive ability was something to be admired and emulated. And so he wrote a few pieces that made reference to Mozart. And even though his particular style was not in any way similar to Mozart's, and his Mozartian music doesn't sound in any way like Mozart's music, Tchaikovsky had that in his mind, that he would try for rationality and clarity and purity of line and so on. And this piece, the Serenade, is one of those. Of course, Mozart wrote a number of very famous serenades, and Tchaikovsky wanted to emulate that and try his hand at it. So he produced this Serenade, which became one of his favorite pieces. He would take it with him anytime he went on tour. He would take this Serenade with him and play it. He loved it that much. It's a great piece, and it's a deserving piece. It's one of his better pieces. It starts out with a tremendous choral introduction that's very, very impressive. I'm sure you've probably heard it, and you'll recognize it when you hear it again. It's like a descending C major scale, but it's very noble and provides a great introduction to the first movement, which he calls piece in the form of a sonatina, in a reference to Mozart. The second movement is one of Tchaikovsky's most famous waltzes. He wrote, of course, many wonderful Russian waltzes, Sleeping Beauty. There's one in the 6th Symphony, the 5th Symphony. They're everywhere. This one is right up there with all of the rest and is played a lot by itself out of the symphony. The third movement is an elegy that is quite beautiful. The 4th movement is based on 2 Russian folk tunes. One is called In the Green Valley, and one is called Under the Green Apple Tree. The first is quoted in the slow introduction, and the second is the basis of the fast movement that follows. At the end of the 4th movement, that big choral introduction returns in a very dramatic point in the music, and then the piece finishes with a flourish. It's an amazing piece of music, and one that's a pleasure to play, and even more fun to listen to. So, February 12th, Saturday, come and hear us. It'll be a great Valentine date. Give your significant other the gift of music. You can always give that toolbox or that tennis bracelet and save that for a birthday or give the gift of music. You won't be sorry. It'll be the best Valentine's Day ever, and we hope to see you there. Thanks a lot.
We hope that you enjoyed this week's edition of Know the Score with George Del Gobbo. If you are interested in supporting the CSO or acquiring tickets for our upcoming concerts, please visit csoga.org. That's csoga.org. We thank you for listening.